Dear beloved, we want to let you know that your willing decision to be part of this growing community is recognized as a true act of love, a beautiful choice to support individuals as they share their life journeys, experiences, and testimonies. Be rest assured that here, you will find real-life testimonies that can inspire transformation, strengthen your faith, and encourage you in times of need. We also kindly ask that you engage with our videos, like, comment, and share, as your interaction helps this community of believers continue to grow and reach others with God's love. This video is another testament to the power of our collective prayers and unwavering commitment. Every prayer you've lifted, every testimony you've watched, every comment you've shared, and every time you've spread the word about this ministry, it all matters. This is the fruit of your faithfulness. Together, we've stood beside new believers and Christians facing unimaginable challenges in some of the world's most hostile environments. We've reached out through prayer, through connection, and through the simple act of showing up again and again in this community. As you watch this testimony, know that you played a part in making it possible. This is what happens when a community refuses to give up, refuses to stay silent, and refuses to forget those who need us most. Your engagement isn't just support, it's partnership in transforming lives. Thank you for being the hands and feet of this mission. Let's continue to stand together, pray together, and witness what God can do through our united efforts. God bless you richly. I was only 8 years old when people in the palace started calling me the little cupbearer. My mother worked as a cook for the king, and because we lived inside the palace walls, I often followed her to the kitchen every morning before sunrise. The smell of roasted lamb and warm bread always filled the air, and the servants moved quickly, whispering and bowing whenever the king's guards passed by. One evening, as the golden lamps flickered in the prayer hall, my mother handed me a small silver cup filled with cool water. She whispered, "Take this to His Majesty. Be careful, Aliyah." I carried it with both hands, walking slowly across the marble floor. The king was kneeling on his prayer mat, facing toward the great hall, with the royal imams behind him chanting in deep voices. My heart beat fast, but I did what I had been taught. I waited until he finished his bow, then quietly placed the cup near him. From that day on, I was chosen to bring the king water every evening. It became my small duty, a tiny thing in a palace full of big people. I never thought much of it until one night I remembered something my mother once told me, that Jesus once said, "Whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst again." I didn't fully understand those words, but they stayed with me. Sometimes, as I stood beside the king holding that cup, I would look at the shining water and wonder, what if the king could drink that kind of water? Not from a river or a well, but from God Himself? It was just a thought, but it felt warm inside my heart, as if someone wanted me to think about it more. That thought kept returning even when I tried to forget. And soon, it became the beginning of everything that followed. That night, the moon was pale and round, hanging like a lamp above the palace towers. The air was dry, so dry that even the plants in the courtyard looked tired. People whispered about the drought. Wells were emptying, rivers were shrinking, and every day the sky stayed silent. I carried the king's cup of water as usual, both hands trembling a little because the silver was cold. Inside the great hall, the king prayed longer than normal, his forehead pressed to the floor. When he finally sat upright, his eyes looked weary. He reached for the cup, and I noticed how dry his lips were. Something in me stirred, a small but strong feeling, like courage mixed with compassion. Before I could stop myself, I spoke. "My Lord," I said softly, "my God says if you drink His water, you will never thirst again." As soon as the words left my mouth, I froze. The whole hall became silent. One of the imams turned sharply toward me with wide eyes. But the king didn't shout or call the guards. Instead, he stared at me for a long moment, his brows drawing together. "Your God?" he asked quietly, as if tasting the words. I nodded, holding the cup tightly so it wouldn't fall. "Yes, my God. He gives water that never dries up." The king leaned back, thoughtful. He didn't smile or frown. He just looked at me, like someone who had heard something impossible yet strangely beautiful. Then he waved his hand slightly, telling me to leave. I bowed quickly and walked backward out of the hall, my heart pounding like a drum. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mother scolded me when she found out what I had said, fearing the king would punish us. But I couldn't regret it. Something inside me felt light, like I had carried a secret message that finally reached where it was meant to go. In the quiet of my small room, I knelt and prayed. I told God I was afraid but also thankful. And deep inside, He let me know that what I said was not foolish. It was planted like a seed. I didn't yet know that the drought outside was only the beginning, and that soon everyone, from the king to the lowest servant, would thirst for something far greater than water. Weeks passed, and the sun grew hotter. The skies above the palace turned from blue to a pale white, as if the heavens themselves had forgotten how to rain. Every morning, people gathered in the market square praying toward the east, asking their gods for water. But the earth stayed cracked, and the wind carried dust instead of cool air. Inside the palace, the kitchens became quieter. Buckets that once overflowed with water were now half empty. Even the king's gardens, once filled with sweet-smelling roses and lilies, began to dry up. I saw the royal servants pulling out dead plants with sad faces, while the king's horses refused to eat. The whole land seemed tired, gasping for a drop of life. One afternoon, I overheard the royal imams arguing in the courtyard. They said the gods were angry and that sacrifices should be made. Some blamed the king's sins, others blamed the people's carelessness. But I remembered the night I told the king about the water that never dries up, and I wondered if this was the moment God was preparing for. That evening, when I entered the great hall again, I noticed something different. The king wasn't dressed in his golden robe. He wore simple white cloth and sat silently, his crown resting beside him. His face looked pale and tired. When I placed the silver cup before him, he didn't touch it. He just asked in a low voice, "Child, what did you mean that night, about your God's water?" His question surprised me so much that for a moment I forgot to breathe. I didn't have fancy words. I only remembered what my mother told me when we prayed together in the kitchen, that Jesus gives life to those who believe in him. So I told the king, it means that only he can give peace to your heart and life to this land. When people believe, he listens and gives rain. The king said nothing, but his eyes followed me as I walked out, and I saw something I had never seen before in his face, a kind of quiet hunger, not for food or water, but for truth. That night, I prayed again. I asked God to show himself to the king, not with fear, but with mercy. And as I prayed, I felt something deep and gentle in my heart, like a whisper that said, "When the world thirsts, I will pour my rain through the faith of the small and the humble." I didn't understand everything then. But I knew one thing. Something was about to happen that would change not just the palace, but the whole kingdom. The morning came with a strange stillness. Even the birds had stopped singing. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the city outside the palace walls was restless. People cried out in the streets for water. Some had begun digging deep holes, hoping to find hidden springs. But every shovel only met dry earth. I was helping my mother in the kitchen when one of the king's guards entered suddenly. His armor was dull from the heat, and sweat ran down his face. "The king asks for the little cupbearer," he said firmly. My mother's hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron, her eyes full of worry. I looked at her and whispered, "It's all right, Mama." But inside I wasn't sure it was. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love for you to be part of this journey. Our community is built on real testimonies and people's struggles, voices that challenge us to think deeper and live with greater clarity. As you listen to this powerful testimony of transformation, we'd love for you to be part of the conversation. Share where you're watching from and what stands out to you in this journey. Your thoughts and reflections aren't just comments. They help shape a genuine dialogue around experiences that have the power to change lives. When I entered the throne room, the king was standing by the tall window that overlooked the courtyard. The fountains below had stopped running days ago. The marble tiles were cracked where water once flowed. He turned when he saw me and said quietly, "Child, I have called every imam, every wise man, and every seer. None of them could bring rain. But you spoke of a God who gives water that never dries up. If what you said is true, then pray to him for us." For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I had never prayed in front of a king before. My legs shook and my mouth felt dry. But then, deep within me, I remembered what I had felt in prayer before, that quiet strength that was not my own. I stepped forward, knelt down right there on the cold floor, and closed my eyes. I prayed simply like I always did. "Father, you see this land. The people are thirsty. Show them you are real. Have mercy and let rain fall." As I prayed, the hall became silent. The king stood still, the guards frozen in their places. I didn't feel anything loud or bright. No thunder, no flash of light, only peace. When I opened my eyes, the king was staring at me, his face unreadable. Then he said softly, "If your God is real, let him answer you." I went back to my room, unsure of what would happen. But that night, as I lay on my small mat, something woke me suddenly. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. I sensed his presence near, filling the air. He revealed to me that the heavens had been waiting for faith, not the faith of the powerful, but of the small and sincere. He let me know that the rain would come, not to prove might, but to show mercy. I knelt again in the dark and whispered, "Then let your mercy fall." By morning, the sound of thunder rolled across the city for the first time in months. The first drops fell softly, like whispers on the palace roof. Then the wind began to move, strong and cool, carrying the smell of wet earth. I ran to the window and saw the clouds breaking open above the city. Rain poured down in sheets, washing the dust from the streets, the trees, and even the palace walls. People shouted and danced in the courtyards. Guards lifted their hands to the sky, laughing as if they had forgotten all their duties. Mothers rushed out with buckets and bowls, trying to catch the falling water. Even the old fountains that had stood dry for weeks began to flow again, their songs returning to the palace grounds. The king stood by his window watching in silence. His golden robe was damp at the edges where the rain had touched him. I saw something in his eyes that looked like wonder and fear too. Not the kind of fear that comes from danger, but the kind that comes when you realize you've seen something far greater than yourself. He turned to me slowly and said, "Your God has heard you." I could tell he was trying to understand. Power, riches, and wisdom had surrounded him all his life, yet none of them could bring a single drop of rain. But now, the prayer of a child had done what his kingdom could not. Later that day, he called everyone, the imams, the servants, and the royal guards, to the great hall. The air still smelled of rain, and the floor was wet with muddy footprints. I stood quietly by the door while the king raised his voice and said, "The drought is over. But not because of our sacrifices or our chants. It is because the God of this little girl has shown mercy." A heavy silence filled the room. The imams looked at each other, unsure what to say. Some frowned, others lowered their eyes. But the guards and servants looked amazed. I could see hope beginning to light in their faces, like lamps being lit one after another. That night, the rain continued to fall, steady and kind. And as I listened to it hitting the roof, I realized that this was not just rain. It was a beginning. Something new had entered the heart of the palace, something no one could stop. But I didn't yet know that this miracle would also bring trouble, for the hearts of men are not easily changed, and not everyone rejoices when truth enters the palace. The next morning, the palace was filled with the smell of wet stone and clean air. Servants were singing again as they swept the courtyards, and laughter echoed through the halls. The drought was over, everyone knew it. But something even greater had begun quietly within the king himself. He called for me after the morning prayers. When I entered, he was sitting without his crown, his robe simple, his hands folded like a humble man instead of a ruler. His eyes were soft when he looked at me. "Child," he said, "tell me about your God." I took a deep breath. My heart pounded, but I spoke gently, just as my mother used to speak to me. I told him that Jesus is the Son of God, that he came not to punish but to forgive, that he listens to the prayers of those who truly believe. I told him that the water that never runs dry is the life he gives to every heart that trusts him. The king listened without interrupting. I could see his eyes glisten as if something inside him was breaking, not with pain, but with understanding. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he knelt right there in front of his throne and bowed his head. I stood frozen, not sure what to do. But deep inside, I felt the Spirit's peace surrounding us. He let me know that this was a moment heaven had been waiting for, that a king was bowing not to power, but to truth. When the king rose again, he was different. His face looked lighter, his voice calmer. He began to walk through the palace, speaking kindly to servants, asking about their families, their needs. It was as though the rain had not only touched the earth but had washed his heart clean. But not everyone rejoiced. That evening, I overheard the royal imams whispering in the corner of the courtyard. Their voices were sharp like knives. One said, "If the king follows this child's God, our place in the palace is gone." Another replied, "The people will turn. We must act before it spreads." My heart sank. I ran to my mother and told her what I heard. She grew pale and held me close. "Pray, Aliyah," she whispered. "Darkness always fights when light begins to shine." That night, I prayed longer than ever before. I didn't ask God to stop the imams or to keep me safe. I only asked that his truth would not be hidden again, not even by fear, not even by power, because I knew the king's heart now belonged to the true king, and that was something no man could undo. Days turned into weeks, and the king's new faith began to show. He ordered the palace gates opened to the poor, feeding them from the royal storehouse. He spoke gently to his servants, and often spent hours alone in his chamber reading the old scrolls I had given him about the stories of Jesus, stories my mother had kept hidden for years. But while light filled the palace halls, shadows gathered in the corners. The royal imams could no longer hide their anger. They met secretly at night in the temple courtyard, their whispers spreading like smoke. I once overheard them from behind a curtain when I went to deliver food for my mother. "He is no longer one of us," one imam said bitterly. "He bows to a foreign god, taught by a mere child." Another added, "If we don't act soon, the whole city will follow him. Even the guards speak of this Jesus now." Their plan was simple but cruel: to accuse the king of abandoning the faith of his fathers, to turn the royal council against him, and to remove him from the throne if he did not deny his new belief. The next morning, I felt fear pressing heavily on my chest. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come easily. I went to the courtyard where the king was walking and told him what I had heard. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder and said, "Child, truth always costs something. But fear is never stronger than faith." Later that night, he called a meeting with the imams in the great hall. I wasn't allowed to enter, but I stayed near the doorway. I could hear their angry voices rise and fall. They demanded that the king renounce his new faith publicly and return to their old ways of worship. The hall fell silent for a moment, and then I heard the king's calm voice reply, "I cannot deny the one who opened the heavens and gave rain when none of you could." There was the sound of footsteps, shouting, and then the heavy doors slammed shut. I ran back to my mother, my heart racing. She pulled me close and whispered prayers through her tears. That night, as I lay awake, fear tried to grow in me. But in that stillness, I felt his presence again, quiet, steady, like gentle rain on dry ground. He let me know that though men might rise in anger, his purpose would stand. He reminded me that the light that shines in the darkness cannot be overcome. And with that peace, I finally closed my eyes, knowing that no matter what came next, the truth had already taken root, and roots that grow in God's mercy cannot be pulled out by hands of men. It began at dawn. The sound of heavy boots filled the palace corridors, and the calm that once rested over the king's home was broken by fear and shouting. The royal guards, who used to greet me kindly, now looked tense and uncertain. Some avoided my eyes altogether. Word spread quickly. The royal council had sided with the imams. They accused the king of betraying the traditions of the land, saying he had brought a foreign faith into the palace. Some demanded he step down. Others whispered that he should be imprisoned until he repented. My mother and I hid in the kitchen storeroom, listening to the echo of angry voices from the throne hall. I could feel her heart beating fast as she held me close. "Stay quiet, Thalia," she said in a trembling voice. "They will not stop until they silence him." Hours passed before the noise finally faded. When I slipped out to look, the hall was nearly empty. The king was sitting alone on the steps of his throne, his robe torn at the shoulder. Yet his eyes were peaceful. When he saw me, he managed a small smile. "Do not fear, child," he said softly. "They can take my crown, but not the truth I have seen." Tears filled my eyes. I wanted to beg him to flee, to hide somewhere safe. But before I could speak, several guards entered, not the ones who once protected him, but those now loyal to the council. They ordered him to surrender his crown and follow them to the inner chamber. I stood frozen as they led him away. But what happened next shocked everyone. As he passed through the courtyard, one of the guards suddenly fell to his knees, crying, "Your God is real." When the rain fell, I knew it was his hand. Another guard dropped his sword and followed. Soon, others bowed too. The imams watching from the balcony shouted in anger, but it was too late. The faith they tried to crush was already spreading among those who had seen the miracle. The guards who once served by force were now moved by faith. That night, chaos and silence mixed in the palace. Some servants fled. Others prayed in secret. And I, a small cupbearer, sat beside my mother whispering prayers into the dark, asking God to protect the king, and to use whatever was happening to turn even more hearts toward him. Before I slept, his presence came again, not in voice but in peace. He revealed to me that the storm had only begun, but through it, rivers of belief would soon flow across the land. I believed him, even if I didn't yet understand how. The days that followed were unlike anything our kingdom had ever seen. What began as quiet whispers in the palace soon echoed through the city streets. The servants who had seen the king kneel before God began to tell others what happened. The guards who had bowed during his arrest shared the story of the rain that came after months of drought. At first, people were afraid to speak openly. The royal imams sent out warnings, saying that anyone who followed the king's new faith would be punished. But faith spreads faster than fear. One by one, people began gathering at night in the courtyards, praying the way the king did, not to idols, but to the living God. I saw things I will never forget. The same market women who used to complain about hunger now shared food with the poor, saying, "The Lord provides." Children began singing songs about mercy and rain. Even soldiers, hardened from years of guarding the palace, knelt together in secret, asking for forgiveness. My mother wept one evening as she watched from the window. "This is the work of heaven, Aliyah," she said. "Your little words planted a seed, and now the land drinks from it." The king, though still under watch, refused to deny his faith. From his chamber, he sent messages to the people through the few guards who still loved him. In those letters, he urged everyone to seek the God of truth and forgiveness. Each message spread like fire, copied and passed from village to village. Soon, even the royal council began to lose control. The imams tried to call for the king's execution, but something restrained them: fear, confusion, or perhaps conviction. Rumors spread that some of them had begun dreaming of a man in light who told them to stop fighting against truth. And while all this was happening, I continued to pray. Every night I whispered to God, asking him to protect those who believed, to keep their courage strong. Often as I prayed, I felt that same peace, gentle, calm, certain. He let me know that what started as one child's act of faith had become a river flowing through the hearts of thousands. I understood then that miracles do not always end with thunder and rain. Sometimes they continue quietly, in changed hearts, in secret prayers, in simple acts of love. And though I was still just a little girl, I could see clearly God had used my small hands to carry more than a silver cup. He had made me carry His living water to a thirsty nation. Now, when I look back, I still see the rain falling over the palace roofs, not just from the clouds, but from heaven itself. I was only 8 when it all began, yet I learned that God does not measure strength by age, size, or power. He looks at the heart that believes. Many years have passed since those days. The palace has changed, and so has the land. People still speak of the drought that ended when a child prayed. They tell their children about the king who bowed to the true king. Some still struggle and others doubt, but faith continues to grow, quietly, like roots under the earth, deep and alive. I often think about what it means to walk with God. It is not always easy. Sometimes you will be mocked. Sometimes people will turn against you, just as they did against our King. But the one who walks with God is never alone. He reveals to me that even when we are small, our prayers reach His throne. He listens. He answers. And when He moves, no one can stop His mercy. So, to everyone who believes, and even those who are still unsure, I want to say this: never be ashamed of your faith. Pray even when the world grows silent. Love even when others hate. Forgive even when you are hurt. Because faith without love is dry, and prayer without the word is weak. But when you hold on to both, you will see His reign again and again. Study God's word as if it is your food. Let it fill your heart with truth. Talk to Him as a friend, not a stranger. And when He asks you to speak, even if you are afraid, do not stay silent. You never know who might drink from the living water that flows through your obedience. I was once just a little cupbearer, serving water in a palace. But when I trusted God, He turned that small act into a story that changed a nation. And if He could do that with me, a child with trembling hands, He can surely use you, wherever you are, whoever you are, to bring His light into the places that thirst for hope.